Hi folks, I'm Ignatiy Vishnevetsky.
And I'm Alex Dowd.
Today we're talking about the nominees for Best Director.
Welcome to a very special Oscar edition of Film Club. So Best Director, I think, is possibly the strongest of the Oscar categories this year in terms of what they chose to nominate. So we have Paul Thomas Anderson for Phantom Thread, Christopher Nolan for Dunkirk, Greta Gerwig for Lady Bird, Jordan Peele for Get Out, and Guillermo del Toro for Shape of Water.
It's a very good mix because we've got two first-time directors. We've got one of the biggest names in kind of the Hollywood blockbuster, and two, well, pretty big-name directors. They're also kind of cult figures. One is a little bit artier, the other one's a little bit geekier, but that stuff overlaps. And you know, a lot of the times you look at the Best Director category and there'll be at least one or two, maybe more, completely baffling names like Morton Tildum, where you don't understand why this person was, why anyone thought this film was exceptionally well directed. But yeah, this is a pretty strong category. These are very worthy nominees. I think, oddly enough, I like Guillermo del Toro quite a bit, but I think this is not his strongest work as a director, though he does, it's some of his strongest work as a director of actors. But I never found the world of The Shape of Water quite as, you could say, seductive or evocative as, say, something like Crimson Peak.
Right, which I think is sort of him at the one might say the peak of his abilities, you know. With Del Toro, I tend to sort of prefer his more genre-leaning work, to be honest. I think that sparks his imagination more. I mean, not that this doesn't have a genre component, but this is also, this would fall into the category of Del Toro films like Pan's Labyrinth, for example, that are sort of more prestige-leaning, you know. He's probably my least favorite in this category, to be honest.
Let's go to the newcomers, because we've got Jordan Peele, Greta Gerwig, both established names. Gerwig as an actress and as a screenwriter, Peele as an actor, as part of a comedy duo, making their debut and sort of
their debut.
Yeah.
I mean, if you liked Frances Ha, if you liked Mistress America, the Noah Baumbach film she co-wrote, so much of that sensibility is right there in Lady Bird as well. Yeah, I mean, I really think that a really sort of deceptively well-directed film in a lot of ways. It doesn't have the scope of a lot of the other movies that are nominated this year. But I mean, we've talked over and over again about how fast it moves.
Yeah, and it is not easy for a film to basically burn through that many locations, to jump through time and feel as fluid as Lady Bird does. And it is mostly her direction that lets us get into the scene, then into another scene, without it basically killing the emotion of the film.
Yeah, and comedy can be very tough to direct, especially this kind of comedy where it's all in the timing. I mean, so many of these short scenes that we're talking about play out like punchlines almost. You know, we jump into a scene, there's a joke, and then we're out, and you have to nail the timing with something like that.
It's not just that. I mean, even things like composition, you know, just getting these scenes to work together, I think is Lady Bird is a very, very intelligently shot film.
Yes.
Which I think is something that doesn't get talked about a lot.
She's great with her actors too. I mean, this has this sprawling ensemble cast, and she's good with all of them, I think.
Yeah. Let's talk about Jordan Peele, though, who I think is a little bit, to me, is actually maybe as much as I like a lot of things about his direction, I think it's the most uneven out of all of the nominees. Which isn't to say that it doesn't do a lot of kind of interesting stuff.
I think he hooks me immediately in Get Out, though. I mean, that first scene, I think, is just such a perfect kind of, I wouldn't quite call it a parody, but it's such a perfect approximation of the language of something like Halloween. You know?
Yeah, like I'll say this, that I think part of the comedy aspect, because it is at times a funny movie, can be confusing, but in a good way, is the fact that it is kind of towing the line between being a horror film and this completely pitch perfect imitation of certain horror film technique.
Yeah, I mean, so he came up in parody. You know, I mean, both as a performer, doing sketch comedy, and and as a writer, I think working on Key and Peele, which would often the nature of a Key and Peele sketch would be we're presenting this straight dramatic scenario, sometimes a direct parody of a kind of movie or television show.
Key and Peele, I think, is one of the best shows at parodying the aesthetics of particular films.
Yeah, so that's a crash course for him as a filmmaker in a lot of ways. So I mean, this might be his first. I mean, it is literally the first thing he's directed, but I mean, being in that environment clearly taught him how to mimic the look and feel of a certain genre. I'm going to cut to the chase. I have a feeling that you and I might share a favorite in this category, or two favorites that are sort of going head to head
that we haven't gotten to yet. Yes. It's no secret that I really like Dunkirk. And I say that as someone who is something of a Christopher Nolan skeptic. I enjoy every Nolan film to a certain degree. I also enjoy ragging on almost every Nolan film to a certain degree. I think his endless dead wife motivations. And
no dead wives in Dunkirk.
No dead wives. No characters who are clearly stand-ins for Christopher Nolan and are dressed like Christopher Nolan. But still a lot of water.
Water and deception.
A ton of water.
And
but I think this takes a lot of the motifs, in some cases, themes that he has long run into the ground, and basically reduces them to their most elemental essence. To me, this is the most elemental Nolan film. I think it, for instance, handles its chronology much more fluidly than Inception did.
Yeah, it's refining that for sure.
And it's just a machine of suspense set pieces.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tour de force in a lot of ways of staging. You know, I mean, a lot of what's really cool about Dunkirk structurally is right there in the script he wrote. But he then has to pull that off. He has to pull that off in a way that's not confusing, in a way that, I mean, I think some people do find this movie confusing, honestly. But he has to take that complex structure and make it work on screen. I also think it's some of the best action he's ever committed to film.
Oh, it's easily, because I don't think he was ever the strongest action director.
Right, which was interesting that he's making these Batman films where I think a lot of the time, in terms of capturing people in motion or things like a fist fight or a car chase, he wasn't always as spatially sort of oriented as you need to be to do that.
Sometimes, his cutting and his staging has always been, with the action scenes, has always been sort of so-so, but not here.
It's much cleaner, it's much easier to follow. And I think there's some really spectacular imagery in this movie, you know, which is not something I always would say about Nolan's work.
But out of all the films, I think Dunkirk is the one that most lives or dies on the strength of its direction.
Yeah, I would agree. What about Paul Thomas Anderson?
But there's Paul Thomas Anderson also with Phantom Thread. And Anderson is such a strange case because he's someone who, when he basically burst onto the scene with the second film with Boogie Nights, who seemed like the next big popular filmmaker, and then just became progressively weirder and weirder with every film.
And then with The Master, I feel like that was the first movie of his that felt 100% like this is a Paul Thomas Anderson movie. And I think that filmmaker is still there in Phantom Thread as well.
Even more, this is shot by him, which is very unusual. He's not credited, but he is actually the director of photography on this film, along with directing it himself.
Yeah, and it looks like almost nothing he's made, and it looks very, in some ways, very old-fashioned. So it sort of has a quality of light that I don't think we see much in movies anymore, period. I mean, I think that Phantom Thread is just this exquisite object in a lot of ways. It's him reaching a point as a filmmaker where he trusts his technique to a point where he doesn't need to do the kind of showboating things he did earlier in his career. He just trusts the simplicity of his technique. I think it's a beautifully arranged film.
Yeah, it is, I think, the mastery, for lack of a better term, I think in his work really starts to appear when he started to let go of long takes and steady cam and these things that are, honestly, they're kind of macho, film schoolish expressions. You know, it's like your swagger. Hey, look at me. I can recreate the Copacabana shot from Goodfellas. Once he, I think, started to let go of that, I think his craft has become so much more refined. I mean, I think he shoots some of the best close-ups of actors. In the current world of film, which is not something that you would have assumed would be his strength. Watching something like Boogie Nights.
So who do you think is going to win this then?
I think it might be Nolan. Okay. I'm not sure. I really have no clue who's going to win. I think it's a pretty strong category overall.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, I think that'll probably be Guillermo del Toro. I think that it's sort of
I was going to say or maybe del Toro because this is maybe like his moment finally.
Yes.
But I'd like to see Nolan win. Or
you like to see Nolan?
It's my favorite of the films, which I was so surprised by how much I liked it.
I would love to see Nolan or Anderson. Honestly, or Gerwig.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
I'll throw her in too. I would love to see Greta Gerwig
You know
win
what?
as well.
They should just give everybody an Oscar.
All 5 of them, they just split it.
Somebody gets the head, somebody gets the legs. You know, I think that's the only fair option this year.
It's not because the fabric is adored by the clients that Cyril is right. It's right because it's right. Because it's beautiful.